So this is the second class that I'm recording for today. My mouth is already starting to get tired of talking, so you have to bear with me. And I just noticed that this is actually from a game that I was playing. It's a game about programming. It's called Human Resource Machine. It's by the same company that made Little Inferno. I just realized that I had it up through all of the last videos. So that must have been a little bit of confusion for everybody who watched the previous class's worth of videos, but that's okay. Um, don't worry about it. If you're interested in learning more about programming, I highly recommend going out and spending if you have a phone capable of playing the game. Human Resource Machine is definitely an excellent way to practice some of these simpler skills, and there are also some fairly fun, difficult challenges that I'd be interested to see who can complete. So if you'd like to go out and spend a couple of bucks on a good game, Human Resource Machine is definitely one of those that is fun to play, has a nice little edgy story in the background, very much like the creators of Little Inferno and their tenacity for doing stuff like that. And so that's my explanation for why the words "the target is awake, take this" is on one of my stickies on my screen. But that being said, this week is about arrays, array lists, and wrapper classes. We finished up repetition in the previous week of classes. Obviously, for you guys, this is more of a week-to-week thing. For me, it's I'm recording this all in one big chunk. Arrays in Java are a not so complicated topic. It follows similar rules to what we've seen with variables, except in this case, what will happen is we will have one variable that is representative of multiple values that can be accessed. So conventionally speaking, let's say we create an int called, let's say, some integer, and we set it equal to 6172. That value is a singular value. Only one thing can be stored in some integer at any given time. If we were to make some integer an array, however, we could store a wide variety of values in some integer simply by referencing it in a particular way, which we'll see in a minute here. Now, some people do get a little hung up on arrays. It's not one of those topics that is heavily covered in basic algebra. In high school algebra, most people don't get into sets and working with sets. If you've had calculus, you've probably seen sets, or if you've taken statistics, more than likely you've seen a set or two. But for the most part, those of us who have taken up through just algebra in high school at this point, you probably haven't seen too much in the way of sets. But you can think of it as sort of a grouping of somehow related values. Usually in algebra, they are related to a particular data set or a particular result from a function. You could consider the two roots of a polynomial function a set, I suppose, if you wanted to. But in this instance, we will cover more Java-centric arrays, Java-centric sets, so to speak, in order to try to clarify this concept. That being said, there is a lot of content for this week. Normally each week there's only maybe a page or two of notes. This week is 3, and as the last 4 chapters progress, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, you will find that there is more content per chapter. So my recommendation to you is if you need to take a break, please do pause the video, come back, watch the video a couple of times if you don't do that already. While this stuff is not necessarily hard, there is a lot of it, and I want to make sure that you guys understand it. Well, arrays don't necessarily have to be used in robot programming. There are certain things that we do in robot programming that may actually benefit from having an array or an array list at our disposal to get the work done. But that being said, let's get started with an example. So I'm actually gonna create the first example of an array that we're going to use. It's going to be an array of integers, and I just want to show you how to create arrays at this point, and what it takes to actually make reference to the values in arrays in Java. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how to create an actual variable that is an array. Now, this will look fairly similar to you, but there will be some sort of weird differences that will make you probably a little uncomfortable, but just bear with me because I will try my best to explain them. As I said in the previous week's videos, when I'm recording these ones, I don't have anybody here with me, so I don't really have anybody to bounce questions off of or ask questions, so it's making the process a little bit more difficult for me. Normally what I would do is I would prompt somebody with a question that was here for the recording and then have them try to answer it and then clarify based on the answer that they actually gave. That being said, this is sort of what I was trying to avoid by doing the classes live and recording them, but due to the nature of how the class has gone, I can't really do that. So that being said, let's move on. So the first thing should be fairly obvious to you what we're doing. We're declaring a type, in this case int, but these brackets here, these square brackets, you're probably never seen this before other than up here in our main method. Basically, this whole assembly right here means that we are declaring an array of integers. We want to create a variable that is an array specifically of the type integer, or int in this case. Those brackets must be there. They need to be in that position because that is what tells Java that this is going to be an array. You have to declare some form of type, and you also have to have those brackets. If you were to try to do this without those brackets there, Java would give you an error. This should be obvious. This is a variable name. We have all kinds of variable names up until this point. Should be no surprise. Obviously, setting equal to something, right? Fairly straightforward. And now here's where we get to the weird, the properly weird here. We've seen new before, but conventionally it's been used with objects, things like scanner. New is used to create a new instance of an object. And I know we haven't talked about creating objects all that much. We talked very generally about it when we talked about scanners. And we know that it needs new in order to create a new object. But you may be wondering, well, int specifically is a primitive type. So why do we have to use new when we're creating an array of ints? Well, in the background, Java treats int as a primitive type when it is by itself, when it is not a part of an array. But when you create an array, an array in Java is actually an object. So you have to use new in order to be able to create one. Java has this built into the language so that you don't have to do any extraneous work other than using new in order to create it. And arrays have a very limited set of methods that they can make use of, but they do have a few that are available to you, and we'll talk about one of them a little later on. But that being said, the way that you do this is you say new, and then you say the variable type. Now the variable type can be an object like scanner, like string, or it can be a primitive type. It can be int, double, boolean, what have you. And then what you do is you put brackets again. This defines that you are creating an array and you're going to store an array in this location. You need to have brackets, and in this instance you need to have a number inside the brackets. Without that number, I thought I saw somebody in the door. Without that number, Java doesn't know how big to create the array. Now in this instance, we are creating an array that is 3 integers. We want to be able to store 3 separate integers in this array. Now one thing that I'd like you to keep in mind is with this version of an array, it cannot expand or shrink unless you recreate the array and move the values over into the new array. Okay? So once we set this as 3, it can only store 3 values, which is fine. We don't need to store any more in this instance. And we will talk about ArrayList later, which can size itself dynamically. It can grow and shrink to fit whatever it is that you are trying to store in it. Okay? So that's the general idea of the first way of how to create an array in Java. We'll see a second mechanism in a minute that's a little bit more compact, but isn't always as easy for people to understand initially. But the next thing that we do is we assign values to each position in the array. Now, when an array first starts out, the values are empty. Depending on what you're storing in the array, it will change what value is there from type to type. If I remember correctly, conventionally speaking, the numeric types like int and double will start off as 0 and will read as 0. But if you were to use an object like string, what will be returned is something called null. Null just means that there is nothing stored at that particular memory location. We won't talk about null much in this class. We may cover it a little bit later. More often than not, in beginning classes, talking about null I find a little bit peaky because it can confuse people. Being able to store nothing in a location, it kind of throws people for a loop. But in this instance, we actually set each of our values before we try to use our array, which is what we want to do. Now, obviously, we call the variable name, in this case, SumArray, same as normal on the left side, but we put brackets. Okay? The brackets help us access the array in its array form. And we start off with index 0, the number inside of the brackets when you are trying to reference a particular location in an array is called the index, and it always goes inside the brackets. Now you may be wondering, why do we start from 0? And this is actually the explanation why all of the class and the book and the chapter names start counting up from 0, and that's because computers start counting from 0. A binary bit is either a 0 or 1. We probably talked about this a little bit in the first class. A binary bit is a 0 or a 1, and so Java starts counting its indexes from 0. So that's what we have to do in order to assign the first position of our array. Our first position is always 0. And the number that we store in that position is negative 26. And then the next position would obviously be 1. We store 48 there. The next position would obviously be 2, which would be 9. Now, normally I would ask the question, what would happen if I said some array square brackets 3 equals 6172, let's say? Well, that actually wouldn't work. Specifically because we sized our array to be 3 items big, 3 ints big. So we already stored 3 ints, 1 in 0, 1 in 1, and 1 in 2. Okay? So there's no other locations to store anything in some array. So saying some array square brackets 3, Java knows that you've gone outside of the bounds of the array and will actually produce an error when your program runs that tells you, hey, you screwed up, your index is out of bounds, is what it will say. You need to go back and make sure that whatever you're trying to store is within the actual scope of your array, how big your actual array is. And so if we actually wanted to use some of these values, we could say system.out.println. Actually, let's do it a different way. Let's do it using a for loop, because this would give me the opportunity to talk about length a little bit. So let's talk about the length the length variable, actually, that I say method because I'm getting mixed up with the next thing I'm going to talk about. Let's talk about the length variable. So let's do for int I equals 0. I is less than some array dot length I plus plus. And then what we'll do is we'll say system.out.println some array I. Okay? Now you all should be fairly familiar with for loops by this point. I shouldn't have to go over those again. If you need more help, you need to ask for it. But if you look at our condition for our for loop, you'll see that I is less than some array dot length. The length that comes after the period is something that every array in Java has. And it is a variable that can be accessed that tells you this number. Okay? So in this instance, what we want to do is we want to count up, starting from 0, up to the number of values that are stored in our array, because that will give us positions 0, 1, and 2. Because remember, we talked about just a moment ago that if you go over the maximum number of your array, you'll get an array index out of bounds exception. Java will get upset with you and tell you to piss off. So what we do is we say less than rather than less than or equal, so that we only go up to that number, and then we stop, because we've already counted through all of our indexes. So if we compile this and we go and rerun it, we'll see that our program runs like normal. We get negative 26, 48, and 9. Those are our values that are stored in our array, which is what we wanted to see. So let's talk about the second format of creating an array in Java. This format is a bit more of shorthand, and is good for some things, but not so much for others. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to call this some other array, actually, so I don't collide variable names. Int some other array, and then we'll do 61, 72, 16. Okay. So obviously the first part is exactly the same as the first part from the other array that we created, just the name is a little bit different. But this is completely foreign. How can we do this? Where is new? Why are we not using new? Is probably what is running through your head right now. This is what is known as an initializer list. Java is smart enough to look at this list of values in curly brackets and say, okay, this is an array of length 3. The first thing that should be stored in index 0 should be 61. The second thing that should be stored is 72. And the third thing that should be stored is 16. And it does this, and it piles it all into the array, and we can actually make use of it in the same way that we made use of the other array. So if we make a copy of this, and we do Control V, and we say some other array.length, and then some other array, if we compile this and we run it, we will see that our program produces now 61, 72, and 16 at the end of our printout. Initializer lists are not used as often as the other format, which is creating a properly new and empty array. They have a very specific set of uses. More often than not, they're used when certain arrays are going to have fixed values. Those values are not going to change. A list of constants, if you were to use terminology from algebra. So I personally don't use them hardly ever. I am more apt to use either the first version that we talked about, or what we will talk about next in the next video, which is array lists. Now that being said, we have pretty much covered everything that I want to talk about in terms of arrays. The next thing that we're going to talk about is array lists, which is actually the object version of an array in Java, and provides a lot more power over the array, let's say, but adding a little bit of complication to the process. So we'll start that video here in a minute.